The oil lamp flickered in the Charleston study at 2:47 a.m. on March 19, 1862, casting shadows that danced across a canvas nobody was supposed to be painting. The brush moved with impossible confidence across the linen surface, laying down Prussian blue for a river that curved exactly like the Edisto, exactly where the old bridge used to stand before the war. The hand holding that brush belonged to a 15-year-old girl who had been declared completely blind since birth. The cotton plantation mistress, Adelaide Thornton, stood frozen in the doorway, her silk nightgown rustling as she tried to comprehend what her eyes were showing her. She had come downstairs because she heard sounds, scratching, movement. The smell of linseed oil hung thick in the air, mixing with the ever-present scent of magnolia that seeped through every crack in the plantation house. What she was witnessing was medically impossible according to every physician in South Carolina. Celeste, the blind slave girl who had never seen a sunrise or a face or her own hands, was painting a landscape so detailed that Adelaide could identify the exact bend in the river where her late husband used to fish. The girl's eyes, those clouded white eyes that doctors had examined and declared sightless, were open, focused, seeing. But what nobody knew yet, not the mistress, not the doctors who would soon arrive, not the newspapermen from Boston and New York who would turn this girl into a national sensation, was that this moment would expose a lie so profound it would shake the very foundations of what the South believed about race, intelligence, and the natural order they had built their entire world upon. The truth was far more dangerous than any miracle. Celeste had arrived at the Thornton plantation in 1847 as an infant, purchased along with her mother from an estate sale in Virginia. The bill of sale, still preserved in the Charleston Historical Society archives, lists her value at $40, half the price of her mother, with a notation in faded ink that reads, "Infant girl, defective eyes, blind from birth." Her mother, Dinah, was a house servant, which meant Celeste grew up inside the main house rather than in the quarters where field hands lived. This detail would prove crucial to everything that followed. The plantation house was a 3-story Georgian structure with 12 rooms, floor-to-ceiling windows, and walls covered in paintings that the Thornton family had collected over 3 generations. Landscapes mostly. Scenes of European countryside, the Hudson River Valley, the South Carolina low country before it was planted with cotton. Celeste spent her childhood in those rooms, led by the hand from place to place, her small fingers trailing along furniture edges, learning to navigate by touch and sound. She was a quiet child. Unusually quiet, according to Adelaide's diary entries from 1852 to 1855, housed now at the College of Charleston. "The blind girl barely speaks," Adelaide wrote in September 1854. "She sits for hours in the same spot, her face turned toward the windows as if she could see what lies beyond them. It unsettles the other servants. They say she is touched by something, God or the devil, they cannot agree which." The other house servants taught Celeste to shell peas, fold laundry, perform simple tasks that wouldn't require vision. But there was something about the way she moved that made people uncomfortable. She never stumbled, never reached tentatively for objects. Her hands found things on the first try, as if guided by memory rather than the careful exploration of someone navigating in darkness. "She walks like she can see," one of the kitchen slaves told the overseer in 1858, according to testimony later recorded during the Freedmen's Bureau interviews in 1866. "We told her to shuffle more, bump into things sometimes, or folks might start asking questions. Because that was the thing about being blind on a plantation in 1858. Blind meant you were useless for field work. Blind meant you stayed in the house, did light work, avoided the cotton fields where people labored from sunup to sundown, their hands bloodied from the sharp cotton bolls, their backs broken by the overseer's expectations. Blind was a kind of mercy, even if it meant living with a lie so complete you could never slip, never forget, never let anyone see you truly seeing. Celeste understood this by the time she was 7 years old. She understood that her clouded eyes, A condition she'd been born with that made her irises appear milky white, were the only thing standing between her and a life that would destroy her body before she turned 20. The painting began almost by accident, or so Adelaide would later claim in the newspaper interviews that made Celeste famous. It was January 1862, and Charleston was gripped by war fever. The men had gone to fight Yankees, and the plantation was running on a skeleton crew of old men, boys, and the house servants who kept the main house functioning. Adelaide's son, Thomas, was 16 and obsessed with drawing. He spent hours at the dining room table sketching military scenes, horses, the plantation grounds. He left his supplies scattered across every surface: charcoal, paper, small tubes of oil paint he'd convinced his mother to order from Savannah before the Union blockade made such luxuries impossible. One afternoon, according to Adelaide's account published in the Charleston Mercury on April 3, 1862, she found Celeste in the parlor holding one of Thomas's charcoal sticks, her fingers black with it. "I was about to scold her," Adelaide wrote, "when I saw what she had drawn on the paper before her. It was a tree, not a childish stick figure of a tree, but an oak tree, detailed and proportioned, with branches that spread in the exact pattern of the oak in our front yard." Adelaide watched as Celeste's hand moved across the paper, adding shadows, texture to the bark, individual leaves. The girl's clouded eyes were pointed down at the paper, but Adelaide convinced herself they could not possibly be seeing what they were drawing. "It must be God," Adelaide told her sister in a letter dated January 28, 1862. "He has given her inner sight to compensate for her outer darkness." That's the story that appeared in the newspapers. A miracle, divine compensation for a life lived in darkness. But the truth was taking shape in the hours after Adelaide went to bed. Celeste had been watching Thomas draw for months, memorizing his techniques while pretending to sleep in her small room off the kitchen. She had been stealing glances at the paintings on the walls since she was old enough to understand what they represented. She had been storing up images her entire life. The curve of the river visible from the second-floor windows, the way Spanish moss hung from the oak trees, the exact shade of gray the sky turned before a thunderstorm. She had been lying for so long that the lie had become a kind of second skin, so much a part of her that sometimes she forgot it was a lie at all. But now, with the paints and canvas available, with Adelaide's belief in divine miracles providing cover, Celeste began to paint in earnest. She started with simple scenes: the front lawn, the slave quarters she could see from the kitchen window. Then she grew bolder. She painted the rice fields at dawn, the exact color of the water when it reflected the rising sun. She painted the slave cemetery with its wooden crosses and scattered flowers. She painted the overseer's house with such accuracy that Adelaide gasped when she saw it, because Celeste had included details Adelaide herself had forgotten: the crooked shutter on the second window, the rose bush that grew wild on the eastern side. "How can you paint things you've never seen?" Adelaide asked her one February morning. They were in the parlor. Rain hammered against the windows. Celeste's hands were covered in paint, yellow ochre, burnt sienna, titanium white. She kept her eyes slightly unfocused, the way she'd learned to do, so they appeared to be looking at nothing in particular. "I see them in my mind, Mrs." Celeste said softly. "God shows me things." It was the perfect answer, the only answer Adelaide wanted to hear. Because the alternative, that this black girl had been lying, that she possessed intelligence and skill and deceptive capability beyond what Adelaide's entire worldview allowed, was unthinkable. The alternative meant everything Adelaide believed about the natural order, about the childlike simplicity of the Negro mind, about the benevolent institution of slavery, was built on a foundation of lies. So Adelaide chose the miracle. She chose to believe that God was working through this blind child, granting her the ability to paint things she could not possibly see. She wrote letters to newspapers. She invited neighbors to come view the paintings. She sent a telegram to Dr. Samuel Morton in Philadelphia, the famous physician who had devoted his career to proving the intellectual inferiority of the Negro race through skull measurements and pseudoscientific analysis. "You must come see this girl," Adelaide wrote on March 1, 1862. "She defies everything we understand about the limitations of her race and condition." The doctors arrived in late March. 3 of them, traveling together from Philadelphia despite the war, because the case was too extraordinary to ignore. Dr. Morton brought with him Dr. Charles Caldwell and Dr. Josiah Knott, both prominent physicians who had published extensively on racial science. Their examination of Celeste on March 24, 1862, was documented in exhaustive detail in Dr. Morton's journal, now held in the Library Company of Philadelphia. They tested her eyes with light, with objects held at various distances, with sudden movements designed to provoke involuntary reactions. Celeste kept her eyes unfocused, her face placid, her responses carefully calibrated to suggest complete blindness. They noted the cloudiness of her irises, the apparent lack of pupil response. "The corneal opacity is complete," Dr. Morton wrote. "No light penetrates, yet she paints with detail that suggests not merely sight but exceptional visual acuity." They watched her paint. She moved slowly, deliberately, her brush strokes careful and measured. She mixed colors on her palette without looking at them, as if guided by some sense beyond vision. She created a landscape of the plantation grounds while the doctors observed, including details of buildings and trees positioned exactly where they existed in reality. "Explain to me," Dr. Caldwell said to her, his voice sharp with scientific skepticism, "how you know to paint the barn on the left side of the canvas when you cannot see the canvas or the barn." Celeste kept her face turned slightly away from him, as if listening rather than looking. "I feel where things should be, sir. God guides my hand." Dr. Knott made a sound of disgust. "God or fraud," he muttered. But they could not prove fraud. They examined her paintings with magnifying glasses, looking for signs of trickery. Perhaps someone else painted them, and she merely claimed credit. But Adelaide swore she had watched Celeste create each one from blank canvas to finished work. They examined her hands for calluses or muscle development that might suggest she possessed normal sight and used it for other work. They found nothing conclusive. They tested her spatial awareness, her ability to navigate rooms, her knowledge of colors and shapes. She performed exactly as a blind person would, hesitant in unfamiliar spaces, reliant on touch and sound, unable to describe colors beyond the names she had heard others use. "It is," Dr. Morton wrote in his final report published in the American Journal of Medical Science in May 1862, "an inexplicable phenomenon. Either this girl possesses some form of second sight unknown to medical science, or we are witnessing a deception so sophisticated it borders on genius. Given her race and circumstances, the former seems more likely than the latter." That final sentence contained within it the very prejudice that made Celeste's deception possible. They could not conceive that a 15-year-old slave girl possessed the intelligence, the acting ability, the sheer sustained willpower to maintain such an elaborate lie. So they chose the miracle. The newspapers chose the miracle. The South, desperate for good news during a war that was going badly, chose the miracle. By summer, Celeste's paintings were being sold in Charleston for prices that shocked even Adelaide. $20 for a small landscape, $50 for a larger work. Money that went directly into Adelaide's pocket, of course, because Celeste was property and property did not own the fruits of its own labor. But Adelaide was generous in her way. She bought Celeste better paints, finer brushes, Belgian linen canvas instead of the cheap cotton duck she'd started with. She moved Celeste into a better room, one with northern light perfect for painting. She allowed Celeste to paint whatever she wished, whenever inspiration struck. It was the most freedom any slave on the Thornton plantation had ever possessed, and everyone knew it. The other house servants watched Celeste with complicated emotions, envy, resentment, grudging admiration. She got herself a good situation, one of the kitchen slaves told the Freedmen's Bureau in 1866. But we knew. We all knew she could see just fine. We saw her eyes track things when she thought nobody was watching. We saw her catch things before they fell. We knew, but we never said nothing. Because what would they do to her if they found out? What would they do to all of us? That was the thing about living in a system built on violence. You learned to keep your mouth shut. You learned that sometimes lying was survival. And survival was the only victory available. The truth began to crack in October 1862. Thomas, Adelaide's son, had returned from the war with a shoulder wound that wouldn't heal properly. He spent his days in the parlor watching Celeste paint. He was 17 now, old enough to have seen things that changed a person, old enough to question what he'd been taught. "How do you know what color to use?" he asked Celeste one afternoon. He was painting a sunset over the cotton fields, mixing reds and oranges with a precision that seemed almost mathematical. "I don't know, Master Thomas," she said. "The colors come to me." He moved closer, studying her face. "Your eyes moved," he said quietly. "Just now, they followed my hand when I gestured." Celeste felt ice water flood her veins. She kept her expression neutral, her voice soft. "That ain't possible, Master Thomas. I've been blind since I was born." But Thomas wasn't stupid. He was young and he'd been taught to believe certain things about the natural order, but the war had shaken those certainties. He'd seen black soldiers fighting for the Union. He'd heard his commanding officers admit that the slaves were more intelligent, more capable than Southern doctrine claimed. He started watching Celeste more carefully. He would drop things near her and watch for involuntary reactions. He would move objects around the room and see if she adjusted her paintings accordingly. He would ask her to paint places on the plantation she supposedly had never been, then check if the details matched reality. On November 3, 1862, Thomas told his mother what he suspected. The conversation, reconstructed from Adelaide's diary and Thomas's later memoir, A Son of the South Remembers, published in 1889, was explosive. "She can see, Mother," Thomas said. "She's been lying to us for years." Adelaide refused to believe it. The doctors examined her. Dr. Morton himself declared her eyes sightless. "Dr. Morton wanted to believe in a miracle," Thomas countered. "We all did, but I've been watching her. She's playing us for fools." Adelaide felt something dangerous rising in her chest. If Thomas was right, it meant Celeste had deceived her. It meant Adelaide had been made a fool of in front of Charleston society, in front of the newspapers, in front of the doctors who had traveled from Philadelphia. It meant a slave girl had been smarter than all of them combined. Worse, it meant Adelaide had been paying Celeste's mother wages for teaching the girl to paint, had been treating Celeste with a kindness that was predicated on divine miracle rather than earned merit. "We'll test her," Adelaide said finally. "We'll know the truth." She devised a trap. She would rearrange the parlor furniture while Celeste was supposedly sleeping, then watch to see if the girl navigated the new arrangement with the hesitant caution of someone truly blind, or with the confidence of someone who could see the changes. But Celeste had lived with this lie for 15 years. She had made it such a part of herself that she navigated by the lie automatically, unconsciously. When she entered the parlor the next morning and found the furniture moved, she proceeded exactly as a blind person would, cautious, reaching out, bumping into the relocated chair, apologizing softly as if the collision was her fault rather than the furniture's. Thomas wasn't satisfied. He pushed for more direct confrontation. On November 15, 1862, he burst into Celeste's room at 3 in the morning, the time when Celeste usually painted. He found her awake, sitting before her easel, but the lamp was unlit and the room was dark. "If you can see," Thomas said, "prove it. Paint something right now, in the dark." Celeste felt everything shifting beneath her feet. She could maintain the lie if she refused, if she claimed she needed light for the divine inspiration to flow. But Thomas would never believe her again. He would watch her constantly. He would eventually catch her in a mistake. The lie had become too heavy to carry. She made a choice. "I can't paint in the dark, Master Thomas," she said quietly, "because I need my eyes to see the canvas." The admission hung in the air between them like smoke. Thomas lit the lamp. In the sudden brightness, Celeste looked directly at him, truly looked at him with focus and intent she'd never allowed herself before. Her eyes weren't clouded after all, Thomas realized with a shock. They had color, they had depth. The cloudiness was there, but it was a defect of the iris, not the lens or cornea, a cosmetic condition that didn't impair vision at all. "How long?" Thomas asked. Since birth, Master Thomas, I've been able to see my whole life. The confrontation that followed involved Adelaide Thomas and the overseer, Josiah Webb. It took place in Adelaide's study on November 16, 1862 at 6 in the morning. Celeste stood before them knowing that her life could end right there. Slaves had been killed for less than this kind of deception. "You made a fool of me," Adelaide said, her voice shaking with rage. "You made fools of doctors, of newspapermen, of everyone who believed in you." "Yes, ma'am," Celeste said. There was no point in denying it anymore. "Why?" Adelaide demanded. Celeste chose her words carefully. "I was 7 years old when I understood that blind meant I didn't have to go to the fields. Blind meant I could stay in the house. I wanted to survive, ma'am, that's all. I just wanted to survive." It was the truth, delivered with a directness that Southern protocol usually forbade from slaves. But Celeste had already crossed every line there was to cross. Josiah Webb, the overseer, spoke up. "Needs to be whipped, public whipping, so the others know there's consequences for this kind of deception." Thomas surprised everyone by disagreeing. "She's made you rich, mother. Those paintings have brought in nearly $800. Are you going to whip away your best source of income?" It was a purely economic argument, the kind that Southern slaveholders understood better than any appeal to mercy or justice. Adelaide sat in silence for a long moment, calculating. The truth was, Thomas was right. Celeste's paintings were valuable. More than valuable, they were selling for prices that increased with each new work. Northern abolitionists were buying them as curiosities. Southern sympathizers bought them as proof of the South's cultural sophistication. The miracle story had made them valuable, but the paintings themselves were genuinely skilled work. The talent was real, even if the blindness was not. "We can't tell anyone," Adelaide said finally. "If word gets out that she's been lying, the paintings become worthless. We become laughingstocks." She looked at Celeste with an expression that mixed contempt with something close to grudging respect. "You will continue to paint. You will continue to pretend to be blind in public, but I will know, and you will know that I know. And if you ever embarrass me again, I will sell you so far south you'll never see daylight again." It was mercy of a sort, though not the kind that involved actual justice or acknowledgement of humanity. It was purely transactional. Celeste was valuable, so she would be preserved. But she would be preserved in her lie, forced to maintain the deception that had saved her life but now trapped her in a different kind of prison. She continued to paint. The newspapers continued to write about the miracle blind girl. Dr. Morton published a follow-up study in 1863, maintaining his position that Celeste possessed inexplicable abilities. Nobody questioned it because nobody wanted to question it. The South needed miracles during a war it was losing. The North needed evidence that slaves possessed hidden potential that could be unlocked by proper Christian education. Everyone needed Celeste to be what they imagined her to be, rather than what she actually was, a brilliant, deceptive survivor who had played the system to save herself. The war ended in April 1865. Celeste was 17 years old when she walked away from the Thornton plantation a free woman. She took with her 3 paintings, her brushes, and a letter of introduction from Adelaide that identified her as the famous blind artist Celeste. The letter was Adelaide's final gift and final cruelty. It perpetuated the lie that had made Celeste famous, but denied her the recognition of her own agency and intelligence. Celeste traveled to New Orleans, then to New York. She continued to paint, continued to let people believe she was blind, because the lie had become the foundation of her fame. She couldn't expose it without destroying everything she'd built. She gave interviews where she described her divine visions. She painted commission works for wealthy clients who paid premium prices for art created by the miraculous blind girl. She became successful in a way that would have been impossible for a black woman artist who admitted to having normal vision. The lie became her brand, her selling point, the reason people paid attention to her work at all. But in private, with a small circle of freed black intellectuals in New York, she admitted the truth. Frederick Douglass met her in 1869 and later wrote in his journal, "I spent an evening with the famous Celeste and learned she is no more blind than I am." When I expressed shock at the deception, she asked Ma, Have you never pretended to be less than you are to survive in a world that wants you diminished? I had no answer to that. If hearing this makes your blood boil, then hit the like button and write in the comments, "Justice for Celeste," because her genius was stolen by the very lie that saved her life. By 1875, Celeste had become one of the most successful black artists in America, male or female. Her paintings sold for hundreds of dollars each. She owned property in Manhattan. She employed other freed slaves in her studio, teaching them to paint, to read, to see themselves as more than what slavery had told them they were. But she never publicly admitted that she could see. The newspapers still called her the miracle blind artist. Exhibition catalogs still described her divine gift. When she died in 1896 at age 48, her obituary in the New York Times perpetuated the myth. Celeste, blind artist, dies. The famous painter who overcame her disability through divine intervention has passed at her home in Manhattan. The truth died with her, or should have. But in 1923, a researcher named Muckus Davura was studying plantation records at the Charleston Historical Society when he discovered Adelaide Thornton's diaries. He found the entries describing the confrontation with Celeste, the admission of deception, the decision to cover it up. He published his findings in the Journal of American History under the title, "The Blind Artist Who Could See: Deception and Survival in the Antebellum South." The art world was stunned. Celeste's paintings suddenly became controversial. Some collectors felt defrauded and demanded their money back. Others argued that the painting's value shouldn't depend on the artist's disability status. The debate revealed uncomfortable truths about why certain artists achieve recognition and others don't, about how narratives of overcoming disability or divine intervention make audiences more comfortable than narratives of strategic deception and brilliant manipulation of white expectations. But here's the thing that nobody wanted to talk about in 1923, and that most people still don't want to talk about now. Celeste wasn't the fraud. The fraud was the system that made lying necessary for survival. The fraud was a society so committed to the myth of black inferiority that they would rather believe in divine miracles than acknowledge that a black girl could be intelligent enough to deceive them. The fraud was doctors like Samuel Morton, who built entire careers on pseudoscientific racism, whose skull measurements and brain weight comparisons were designed to prove predetermined conclusions about racial hierarchy. The fraud was newspapers that would pay hundreds of dollars for a story about a miraculous blind slave girl, but wouldn't pay 5 cents for a story about a normal black girl with exceptional artistic talent. The fraud was Adelaide Thornton, who kept the profit from every painting Celeste created, who maintained the lie because it made her rich, who wrote in her diary that she was being generous by not whipping a girl who had committed the crime of being smart. Celeste was a survivor. She was a genius who understood that in 1847 America, a blind black girl had more value than a seeing one. She was an artist who recognized that white audiences needed her to be broken in some way before they would celebrate her talent. She was a teenager who made a calculation that pretending to be disabled would save her from labor that would destroy her body, and that maintaining the pretense would open doors that would otherwise stay locked forever. Stop, pause, take a moment to think. If your understanding of history has just shifted, hit like and show that you're moving toward the truth. Celeste spent 30 years trapped in a lie she created to survive. How many others did the same and will never know their names? The pattern didn't end with Celeste. The system that made her deception necessary continued long after slavery ended. Black artists, intellectuals, and professionals throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s learned to perform versions of themselves that white audiences found acceptable. They learned to speak in ways that didn't threaten. They learned to present their intelligence as exceptional rather than normal, as divine gift rather than earned skill, because acknowledging normal human capability in black people threatened the entire structure of segregation and white supremacy. Booker T. Washington's famous Atlanta Compromise speech in 1895 was essentially the same strategy: appear non-threatening, emphasize practical skills over intellectual equality, let white audiences believe they're being generous by allowing limited black advancement. W.E.B. Du Bois called this double consciousness, the necessity of seeing yourself through the eyes of a society that views you as inferior, and constantly adjusting your presentation to navigate that distorted perception. But Celeste's case was more extreme because her deception wasn't just about manner or presentation. It was about fundamental ability. She pretended to be disabled to avoid exploitation, then leveraged that pretended disability to build a career. She turned the system's prejudices against itself. She made them pay her for the privilege of believing their own myths. That's not fraud. That's survival at the level of genius. Modern disability rights activists have complicated feelings about Celeste's legacy. On one hand, she perpetuated the idea that disabled people need to be exceptional to have value, that a blind person is only worth paying attention to if they can perform miracles. She contributed to inspiration porn, the problematic tendency to treat disabled people as objects of inspiration rather than complete human beings with normal ranges of ability. On the other hand, she was a slave. She was working with the tools available to her. She identified a category, disabled, that offered marginally better treatment than able-bodied slave, and she used it to save herself. Disability scholars like Patricia Ferreira have argued that Celeste's story reveals how disability itself is a social construct, a category that changes meaning depending on who's being categorized and why. In 1850s South Carolina, blind meant exempt from field labor for a house slave, but it might have meant something entirely different for a white person of the same age. The meaning of disability shifts depending on the power structures it exists within. Celeste understood this instinctively. She understood that her clouded eyes, a cosmetic condition that didn't impair her vision, could be interpreted as complete blindness if she performed blindness convincingly enough. She understood that the medical establishment would rather believe in miracles than admit a black teenage girl had fooled them. She understood that under slavery, agency itself was so restricted that deception became one of the only available forms of self-determination. The financial trail tells its own story. Records from Adelaide Thornton's estate, probated in 1879, show that Celeste's paintings generated approximately $12,000 between 1862 and 1865, the equivalent of roughly $400,000 in 2026 dollars. Celeste received none of that money. After emancipation, working under her own name and selling her own work, she generated approximately $45,000 between 1865 and her death in 1896, about $1.5 million in modern terms. The paintings themselves tell a story too. The landscapes Celeste created while enslaved focus on plantation grounds, the world she was confined to. They're beautiful, technically skilled, but they're landscapes of captivity, fields that meant labor, rivers that marked boundaries she couldn't cross, trees that stood as landmarks in a world that restricted her movement. The paintings she created after emancipation shift dramatically. She painted cities, New York, Philadelphia, New Orleans. She painted ports and ships and horizons. She painted her own studio with herself visible in a mirror, looking directly at the viewer with eyes that saw everything. Those later paintings are declarations. They say, I see, I saw all along, and now I'm free to paint what I choose rather than what you expect. But she never made that declaration verbally. She never publicly admitted the deception. Why? Some historians argue she was protecting her market value, that the blind artist brand was too valuable to abandon. Others suggest she was protecting herself from criminal fraud charges, though it's unclear what law she would have broken. The most persuasive explanation comes from Celeste's own correspondence, particularly a letter she wrote to Frederick Douglass in 1871. You ask why I don't tell the truth about my sight. I ask you, what is the truth? The truth is I survived slavery by any means available. The truth is they wanted me to be blind, so I gave them blind. The truth is my art is real regardless of what eyes created it. The truth is I don't owe them one single honest word after they stole 18 years of my life. They wanted you to never find out about this. But now you know. Now the power is in your hands. Hit like and show that you are not afraid. Demand that history acknowledge survivors like Celeste who refused to be destroyed, even if it meant becoming someone else entirely. The conspiracy wasn't one person's crime. It was systemic. It was a medical establishment so invested in theories of racial inferiority that they examined Celeste and saw what they wanted to see, ignoring evidence that contradicted their worldview. It was newspapers that profited from the miracle story without investigating too deeply because the truth wouldn't sell as many copies. It was an economic system built on stolen labor that appropriated even Celeste's deception, turning her survival strategy into a commodity that enriched her enslaver. It was a society so thoroughly committed to maintaining racial hierarchy that acknowledging a black girl's intelligence would have required dismantling foundational beliefs about who deserved freedom and why. Adelaide Thornton knew the truth by November 1862. She chose to suppress it for financial gain. She died wealthy in 1879, her obituary praising her as a supporter of the arts who had nurtured the talent of the famous blind artist Celeste. No mention of the confrontation, no mention of the theft, no mention of how she'd built her late-life prosperity on the forced labor of a girl she knew was being exploited. Dr. Samuel Morton died in 1851 before he examined Celeste, but his intellectual heirs like Dr. Caldwell and Dr. Not perpetuated his racial theories until their own deaths in the 1870s and 1880s. They never retracted their published articles about Celeste. They never acknowledged the possibility of deception. Their careers remained intact, their reputations as scientists unstained by the fact that a teenage girl had made fools of them. Thomas Thornton, Adelaide's son, lived until 1903. His memoir, published in 1889, contains the only contemporary first-hand account of discovering Celeste's deception. He writes with something approaching remorse. "I was 17 when I realized she could see. I felt betrayed at first, as if she owed me honesty. But I came to understand that slavery made honest impossible. Every interaction between master and slave was built on lies. The lie that we were superior, the lie that they were content, the lie that the system was ordained by God. Celeste simply told a lie that served her rather than us. I cannot condemn her for that, though my mother did until her dying day. The broader system adapted, of course. It always does." After emancipation, when the myth of the docile, simple-minded slave became harder to maintain in the face of black literacy, black business ownership, black political participation, the system simply invented new lies. Lies about black criminality, lies about black intellectual inferiority that were harder to disprove than the old ones, lies about separate but equal, lies about quotas and reverse discrimination. The lies changed shape but never stopped, because the system's survival depended on maintaining the fundamental myth that racial hierarchy was natural and inevitable rather than constructed and maintained through violence. Celeste's paintings hang now in museums. The Smithsonian owns 3. The Metropolitan Museum of Art owns 2. They're displayed with plaques that describe her as previously believed to be blind or self-reportedly blind. Language that's carefully neutral but still somehow implies deception rather than survival. They're worth millions now, these landscapes painted by a girl who was enslaved, who used the only tool available to her, a physical characteristic that could be misinterpreted as disability, to avoid being worked to death in cotton fields. But here's what nobody puts on those museum plaques. Celeste taught herself to paint by studying the works hanging in Adelaide Thornton's house, memorizing techniques while pretending to be unaware of the visual world around her. She learned color theory by listening to Thomas Thornton's art lessons, and then experimenting in secret during the hours everyone else slept. She developed her technical skill through thousands of hours of practice that she had to hide because being good at painting might make people question whether she was really blind. Every achievement she claimed was actually double the achievement, because she had to accomplish it while maintaining an elaborate deception that required its own form of genius. She had to be good enough to be valuable, but not so obviously skilled that people questioned the divine miracle narrative. She had to paint landscapes with the kind of detail that suggested direct observation, but not so much detail that it became impossible to explain through spiritual vision. She had to perform blindness every waking moment while simultaneously creating art that required vision. That's not fraud. That's expertise at multiple disciplines simultaneously. That's intellectual and creative ability operating at a level that maybe a dozen people in any generation achieve. And yet the historical consensus about Celeste, even among sympathetic historians, tends to emphasize the deception rather than the achievement. The title of Marcus de Verreaux's 1923 article wasn't Celeste, Artistic Genius Under Slavery. It was The Blind Artist Who Could See, Deception and Survival. The emphasis on deception rather than survival, on fraud rather than resistance, reveals how deeply we still struggle to understand the strategies enslaved people used to maintain their humanity in a system designed to erase it. Frederick Douglass wrote about this in his autobiography, how he had to pretend to be less intelligent than he was, had to hide his literacy, had to perform the role of contented slave when he was planning escape. Was that fraud? Or was that a brilliant tactical response to captivity? Harriet Jacobs spent 7 years hiding in an attic crawlspace to avoid sexual exploitation by her enslaver. She let everyone, including her children, believe she had escaped north when she was actually 3 feet above their heads. Was that fraud? Or was that survival? Celeste spent 15 years performing blindness to avoid field labor that would have destroyed her body. She maintained the performance even after emancipation, because the lie had become her foundation for economic independence. Was that fraud? Or was that a woman making the best choices available within an impossible situation? The Thornton plantation still stands, though it's been converted into an event venue. You can rent it for weddings. The website describes its historic charm and antebellum elegance. No mention of the people who were enslaved there. No mention of Celeste or her mother Dunna, or the kitchen slaves who kept her secret, or the field hands who never got the option to pretend their way into better treatment. The parlor where Celeste painted has been restored with period-appropriate furniture. The docents who give tour mention that a famous artist once lived there, but they don't mention she was enslaved, and they definitely don't mention the deception that made her famous. It's easier to focus on the architecture, the furniture, the aesthetics of the antebellum period without dealing with the reality of what made that aesthetic possible. That's its own kind of deception, isn't it? A cultural lie we tell about the past to make it more comfortable for the present. Celeste died of pneumonia in 1896, 3 months after her 48th birthday. Her obituary ran in newspapers across the country. Most of them perpetuated the blind artist myth. A few, including a black newspaper called the Cleveland Gazette, acknowledged the truth. Celeste, the famous artist once believed to be blind, has passed. She was, in fact, never blind at all, but rather a genius of survival who understood that in America, a disabled black woman could achieve what an able-bodied one could not. She leaves behind a body of work that stands as testimony to the lengths one must go to be heard in a nation that prefers its marginalized people silent or exceptional, never simply human. She was buried in Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, in a plot she'd purchased herself with money from her paintings. Her gravestone, still visible today, reads simply, Celeste, artist, 1847-1896, she saw more than most. That epitaph was chosen by Celeste herself, written into her will. It's ambiguous enough to maintain the miracle narrative for those who want to believe it, but those who know the truth understand it as her final statement. She saw more than most, literally, because she could see and people thought she couldn't, but also metaphorically, because she understood the system she was trapped in with a clarity that let her manipulate it. She saw through the lies they told about racial inferiority and natural order. She saw that identity itself could be a strategy, that performing expectation could create space for unexpected achievement. She saw that sometimes the only way to be free was to become exactly what they expected, so expertly that they never looked past the performance to see the person underneath. She saw, and she used what she saw, and she survived when survival meant becoming someone else entirely. How many other Celeste were there? How many enslaved people performed versions of themselves that were strategic rather than authentic? How many pretended to be less intelligent, less capable, less human than they actually were because the alternative was death or destruction? We'll never know because the ones who were successful at deception left no record of it. That's the whole point of successful deception. But we can look at the patterns. We can look at how consistently white Americans have been surprised when black Americans demonstrate capability, intelligence, creativity, agency. We can look at how every generation produces the same shuck. They can read, they can govern, they can create art, they can excel in sports, they can win Nobel Prizes, as if each achievement is unprecedented rather than the predictable result of lifting restrictions. We can recognize that consistent surprise reveals consistent underestimation, and consistent underestimation suggests that the lies Celeste had to tell were required by a system that couldn't function without believing them. The conspiracy isn't hidden in the past. It's still operating. It's operating every time someone assumes black students got into college through affirmative action rather than merit. It's operating every time a black professional is asked to speak for their entire race. It's operating every time someone describes an articulate black person with surprise, as if articulation is unexpected. It's operating every time we celebrate black achievement as exceptional while treating white achievement as normal. The lie Celeste told, that she was blind when she wasn't, was a response to a bigger lie, a foundational lie that America told about who deserves full humanity and who doesn't. That foundational lie required constant maintenance, constant adjustment, constant violence to enforce. It required people like Adelaide Thornton to suppress evidence that contradicted it. It required doctors like Samuel Morton to build pseudoscientific theories that justified it. It required newspapers to publish miracle stories rather than acknowledge ordinary black competence. It required millions of individual acts of willful blindness, choosing to see divine intervention rather than deception, choosing to believe in natural inferiority rather than structural oppression, choosing to celebrate exceptional black achievement while ignoring systemic black exclusion. Celeste's legacy is complicated. She's claimed by disability rights activists as an example of disability fraud that harms actual disabled people. She's claimed by black historians as an example of resistance and survival under slavery. She's claimed by art historians as an important but problematic figure whose work's value shouldn't depend on her disability status. She's claimed by scholars of deception as a case study in long-term strategic lying. Everyone wants to make her fit their narrative, which means nobody's really seeing her clearly. Maybe that's appropriate. She spent her whole life being misinterpreted, being seen as what people needed her to be rather than what she was. Why should that change after death? But if we're going to learn anything from her story, it should be this. The fraud wasn't Celeste's lie. The fraud was the system that made lying necessary. The fraud was slavery itself, which required constant deception from everyone, enslaved people lying to survive, enslavers lying to justify their actions, a nation lying to itself about what it was built on. Celeste just told a different lie than expected, one that served her instead of them. That's not criminal. That's revolutionary. In a system built entirely on deception, the most radical act was choosing which lie to tell. Today, you didn't just watch a video. You kept a suppressed truth alive. Celeste spent 18 years enslaved, 15 of those trapped in a lie she created to survive, then 30 more years after emancipation still unable to escape the myth that had saved her life, but denied her full recognition of her genius. In 2026, we still struggle to see Black achievement as normal rather than exceptional. We still require narratives of overcoming, of exceptional hardship that produces exceptional result. Because acknowledging that systemic exclusion rather than individual limitation is the real barrier would require changing systems that still benefit some people at the expense of others. If you want more people to know this story, share it. Like it if you believe Celeste's survival strategy was brilliant resistance rather than simple fraud. Write in the comments. She saw everything, because she did. She saw the system clearly enough to beat it, if only partially, if only temporarily. Subscribe because the next video reveals an even darker truth, the story of the enslaved man who became a successful doctor by pretending to be white, and what happened when his Black wife exposed him to save herself. The system required lies from everyone. Some lies were survival, some were exploitation. Knowing the difference is how we fight back. I can't do this alone. I need you. Tell me, will you stay silent or will you fight?